Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I'm Jack DeGioia. I serve as the president here, and we gather here in Copley to engage with distinguished educator and author Dr. Gary Orfield on his new book, The Walls Around Opportunity, The Failure of Colorblind Policy for Higher Education. He's a distinguished research professor of education law, political science, and urban planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. And Dr. Orfield has dedicated himself to the study of educational policy, racial inequality, and civil rights. And this afternoon's event is part of the series, Our Compelling Interests, a transformative program that explores diversity through the work of leading scholars and writers, convened by the University of Michigan Center for Social Solutions. And we are honored to partner with the center to bring this conversation here to Georgetown. To help guide our conversation and offer their reflections, we're joined by the leaders and editors of this series, the Chancellor of Rutgers University Newark, Nancy Cantor, and Dr. Earl Lewis, the Director for Social Solutions, and the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor at the University of Michigan. Our conversation will be moderated by our colleague, Dr. Sabrina Wesley-Nero, teaching professor, Assistant Director of the Master of Arts in Educational Transformation, and co-director of our program in Education, Inquiry, and Justice here at Georgetown. I wish to express my deep gratitude to our entire panel, Gary, along with Sarita Brown, Tony Carnevale, and Rosemary Kilkenny, for offering their insights and perspectives during our discussion. Gary's latest book, The Walls Around Opportunity, provides us with the foundation for our conversation this afternoon through its urgent and timely reflections on systemic inequality and the role of race-conscious policies in addressing long-standing and persistent racial discrimination in our nation. We are asked to consider the role of higher education. What more can we do as individual institutions and across higher education to advance racial equity and justice? How can our practices, our policies, how can our culture be shifted to take into account the historical legacies that still shape our institutions and our society? This afternoon, inspired by Gary's solutions-oriented work and through the reflections of this terrific group of colleagues, we have the opportunity to understand more deeply the work we must take on in the time ahead if we are to uphold our commitments to access and success for all of our people. And we're here this afternoon thanks to the contributions of Dr. Earl Lewis. There are few who have contributed greater leadership at the intersection of higher education and philanthropy than Dr. Lewis. For 5 years, he served as the president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, a philanthropic organization devoted to the arts, humanities, and higher education. And under his leadership, the foundation had a deep focus on diversifying higher education, on enhancing graduate education, the liberal arts, and digital learning. Since concluding his time at the Mellon Foundation, Earl rejoined the University of Michigan and established the Center for Social Solutions. And the center has 4 areas of focus, in their words, and I quote, diversity and race, slavery and its aftermath, water insecurity, and the dignity of labor in an automated world, close quote. As part of its work, the center is responsible for convening this series, Our Compelling Interests. And over the course of his distinguished career, Earl has served at Emory University as its Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost, and as its Asa Griggs Candler Professor of History and African American Studies. And prior to his recent return to the University of Michigan, he had previously served there as a faculty member and led the Center for Afro-American and African Studies. He's also served on the faculty at Emory and at the University of California, Berkeley, and is responsible for co-editing the expansive 11-volume series, Young Oxford History of African Americans, with his colleague Robin Kelly. He's the author of In Their Interests, Race, Class, and Power in 20th Century Norfolk, and co-authored Blacks in the Industrial Age, A Documentary History. Earl, we're honored to host you and your colleagues here this afternoon, and are deeply grateful for the work that you have advanced over the course of your exceptional career. And there's no conversation more important right now in higher education than this conversation that you are helping to lead We look forward to engaging with you this afternoon. I now wish to ask to join me Dr. Earl Lewis.
It is a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and Jack, thank you for that warm welcome and that gracious introduction. This project, while this is 2022, has its origins almost a decade ago. In December of 2012, even before I took over as president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, we had a convening in New York City in the Mellon offices. And at that point, we were reflecting on the world post-Grutter and Gratz, the cases that the University of Michigan took to the Supreme Court, and asking about how university leaders understood the importance of diversity as we tried to figure out how to expand opportunity for all. And Nancy Cantor, who was then president of Syracuse University, and I leaned over and looked at one another and said, we got work to do. Because it was clear that while we had brought together a cross-section of university presidents, general counsels, and others, not all of them understood the law, let alone understood what they could do, and even more, what they should do. And so we looked at each other and said, okay, we're going to bring together the best scholarship possible to talk about the value of diversity for a prosperous democracy. Hence was born the series, Our Compelling Interest. And for us, we thought it was critical to do three things. One, to define diversity, but then to also provide a context and the resources for people to value diversity. And then realizing that too was not sufficient if we didn't actually leverage diversity for the prosperity of the entire nation. And so the Our Compelling Interest series, which this most recent volume is number 4, and we have several others in the making, is an attempt to do that very thing, to define, to value, and to leverage diversity for the benefit of all. And so we're delighted to be in conversation with you today, and we welcome the opportunity to engage in not just conversation and dialogue, but your own thoughts on how to define, value, and leverage. It goes without saying this day would not be possible without the incredible help and aid of a number of people here at Georgetown University, in particular President DeGioia and the President's Office, and played a critical role in making sure we were able to be here this afternoon. I want to call out my colleagues at the Center for Social Solutions, many of whom are here in the room, but not all, but they all had a role in bringing us together. And then, of course, I want to single out Nancy Cantor, who has been working with me and with us in this endeavor since its inception. And then the support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which has underwritten the work and that has gone into this series, Our Compelling Interest. And finally, I would note that our media partner and publishing partner, Princeton University Press, has been critical as well. We're going to show you a short video, after which Sabrina Wesley-Nero, who's already been introduced, will convene the group here, the panel, to begin to really dive into Gary's work, The Walls Around Opportunity, the failure of colorblind policy for higher education. We welcome that, but before we do, let's look at a short video. And again, thank you.
This book, The Walls Around Opportunity, The Failure of Colorblind Policy in Higher Education, is a message to higher education and to public schools that we're on the wrong path, that it's not working, that it's neglected the basic reality of our society, which is racial difference, racial exclusion. The colleges are a precious resource in terms of offering opportunity to people of color and offering opportunity for everybody to be trained to be leaders in our major institutions across racial and ethnic lines. We can't do this without explicitly thinking and acting on racial inequality. That if we try to do it in some indirect way, it won't work, because the root of the problem is in the racial inequality that hits people of color from even before they're born.
If you look back at the policy of the 1960s and when Johnson declared his war on poverty, the cost of public education was mostly met by the Pell Grant. But in the late 70s and early 80s, increasingly states began to pull back their support for public higher education. Many states, we ended up spending more money per capita on incarceration than on education. And you kept thinking, okay, how did our priorities shift?
Look at higher education and say, are we doing the expansive talent search? Are we looking at the assets of students or only thinking of their deficits and how we could maybe help them? Let's not help them, let's actually empower them and bring them to the table. In reversing the really deleterious effects of these decades of colorblind policies, we have to think about what race-sensitive and race-conscious policies look like. How will they really function on the ground in educational settings? But we have to do that not in a vacuum. We have to do that taking into account the lives and neighborhoods and histories that students actually come from.
The history of discrimination goes between generations. If your parents were denied an education, they don't have the resources to send you to college. They don't have the resources to get into a neighborhood with good schools. They don't have the knowledge of how you connect with college that people whose parents have been to college have. That's a direct intergenerational effect. It passes from one generation to the next, especially within the context of residential and educational segregation.
In addition to our retreat from a conversation about diversity, there's really a broader retreat from an encounter with history. We want to walk away from the past because it may make us uncomfortable. But if you can't talk about the history of the United States in K through 12, and you realize only a fraction of Americans actually go on to higher education, when will all the citizens of our country understand our past? Because failing to understand it means then we can't account for the present, let alone begin to design a future. And so if you start with the premise, as we have in this series, that talent is equally distributed across the world, access to opportunity is not. We come back to then the importance of defining, leveraging, and valuing diversity for a prosperous democracy.
What more important lever for that valuing diversity and leveraging diversity is there than education? Without educational opportunity, the systems that have excluded will win out. And the only way we're going to get educational opportunity is to take down the walls around opportunity.
What's happened as the country's changed racially, our civil rights policies have retreated and been reversed and attacked and assailed, and they're now under tremendous threat in the United States Supreme Court, which is the most conservative Supreme Court we've had in more than 90 years.
And as Gary's book really pinpoints, the segregation in our schools by race and class is really undermining the ability of everybody to live together in a multiracial democracy.
And what we're trying to end up really suggesting to a broader set of publics is that this is a we, not just an I, framing of the question of diversity.
I want to welcome everyone here and thank you for joining us and for this engaging conversation I've been looking forward to ever since I heard about it. I wonder that if you envision an America where justice is actually for all. If you do, you may feel disappointed at this moment. Instead of expanding opportunities, membership, and participation, we see strong movements to limit and exclude. The Walls of Opportunity, this great book, evokes imagery of walls that can be constructed to protect what's inside and keep those out who are unwanted. Walls built for protection imply that what is inside is valuable. Keeping others out implies that they have no right to the land or the opportunity, that they pose a threat, and walls are built as defense. From where I sit, we see efforts to limit what is taught in K-12 schools to a simplified narrative that names the country's one original sin and then declarations of a post-racial society where equal opportunity is supposedly ubiquitous if one just works hard enough. These struggles in K-12 schools are directly related to efforts to dismantle any attempt to redress generational injustice, to reverse any progress we've made in access to higher education, and the efforts that we have even yielded some modest progress. We are either fighting to progress or we're standing still with our feet chained to our history of oppression, which pulls us backwards. I wonder who is served when generations of racially minoritized youth are denied access to an education that is culturally affirming, that is liberatory, that is academically sound. And who is served when students, all students, but particularly generations of white affluent youth, are denied access to an education that interrogates the myth of meritocracy, deconstructs stereotypes of any identity that's not normalized, and dethrones from the hero's seat those who fought to maintain their privilege by keeping others subjugated. Similarly, who benefits from the misuse of diversity as a framework? What we really are seeking is to address inequity and injustice. Even if we are wrestling at this time, perhaps, and maybe taking 2 steps back, when did we leap forward? And what must we do to run ahead? Hopefully that's what we will examine this afternoon. When have we made progress toward addressing inequity and extending opportunities in and through education? And what more can we do given our current context to move closer to that goal? So today we have this illustrious panel joining us. Gary Orfield, the author of the book, whose introduction's already been given. Rosemary Kilkenny, Vice President for Institutional Diversity and Equity and Chief Diversity Officer here at Georgetown University. Tony Carnevale, Director of the Center of Education and the Workforce at Georgetown University. And Sarita Brown, Co-founder and President of Excelencia in Education. Thank you all for joining us. So this afternoon I have a few questions for the panel, and then we will open it up from questions from the audience. We'll start with you, Gary. So in the book, you make the argument that there is a demographic imperative for us to address inequities in access in higher education, an economic imperative, and a democratic imperative. Is there a moral imperative as well? And if so, what is it?
Yes, all of the above. When this book was created and when it was originally conceptualized, it was an effort to look at some of the most powerful and successful institutions in American society, our higher education system, the envy of the world, the most remarkable system that's ever been created for higher education of many millions of people. It's a goal of all of our institutions, if you look at their statements of their institutional goals, to be equitable, to welcome people from all backgrounds and so forth. But the entire system as an aggregate is perpetuating inequality. It's profoundly perpetuating it. It's actually admitting the students who are most privileged at a very disproportionate level, excluding those who are least privileged, not even starting them in college or sending them to colleges where almost nobody finishes or nobody transfers in the case of our giant system of community colleges. It's a system that believes itself to be righteous, and as a person who's taught in 4th and 6th grade universities, I've always seen the opportunities that are created to transform lives of individual students and groups of students. But it is a system that, as it operates now, does perpetuate inequality. It does benefit the benefited, often exclude the most marginalized people in our society, and has no effective remedies. Our basic financial aid system, for example, the theory of the book is there's not just one wall. It's not just about getting into the colleges. It's about especially preparation and being able to afford to go and to remain and to finish college. and to have the support systems that are necessary to do that. If you look at the whole system, it is giving privilege to privileged. It is not addressing the inequality of the society, and it is creating an aura of merit around that that says the people who are most privileged are the ones who deserve the privileges that they get and the credentials that they're awarded through the higher education system. So, of course, this is a moral imperative as defined by universities themselves, but as a system, it is not working. It's fundamentally flawed, and it's becoming worse in some ways, and we are facing the very high probability that the United States Supreme Court is going to end the modest efforts we've made for race-conscious admissions and support systems that have existed since the Civil Rights Movement. They were created in the Civil Rights Movement back in the 1960s and early 70s. That was the last period in which we've had a strong, really positive agenda, both for the race and the class inequalities that exist in our society. Since then, we've fallen very far away from it. We've shifted the burden of paying for college, for example, from the state governments as the basic payer, and from the federal government as with a financial aid system that would pay up to 3/4 of the cost of educating a low-income student in a four-year state university, to one that has shifted the burden to families and to individual students, creating this huge debt crisis that the president has recently been trying to partially address. It's a system that is increasingly stratifying students by their economic means and by their increasingly segregated public high schools and elementary schools into a pattern that will create enduring racial inequality, even as the society becomes predominantly non-white. When the civil rights laws were passed and the Pell Grant was created back in the 60s and 70s, we were a society that had 80% white students. We're now a society that has about 45% white students and is continuously changing. We have not adapted to that change. We have not adapted to the fact that college has not become an option, but higher education has become an essential if you're going to have any kind of secure middle-class society, status in our society. And we have continued to ration the opportunity in ways that are extremely destructive. How it can be reconstructed is a basic subject of the final part of this book.
Thank you. You argue that colorblind policy is not neutral.
The basic argument of the book is that we've been through three basic stages in higher education in the United States in terms of service to students of color. The first is a very long period from the beginning of our higher education systems until the 1960s of exclusion, particularly from selective universities. We had almost no significant presence of students of color in our selective universities until the Civil Rights Movement. It really happened in the early 1960s that we began to open up our system. When I went to the University of Virginia as a young assistant professor, we had less than 1% black students in a state that was about 25% African American, for example. And nobody was doing anything very dramatic about it. It was opened up because there was a movement and because there were laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 addressed the 17 states that had separate school systems. Actually, 19 states had separate higher education public institutions for black students. It began to disestablish that, and all over the country there was a social movement on individual campuses that led to the creation of affirmative action. That's the last time we've had a really strong focus on this issue. And it had some enduring effects, but it depended on the provision of space and the affordability and of the positive outreach. Those were key elements in making that the progress that we made, which reached its peak really in the late 1970s, when we reached the level of equity that we never experienced before. Beginning in the 1980s, we turned towards what I call colorblind policy. We shifted the burden from states to individuals. We cut taxes and really diminished the ability of public institutions to serve the public well, or for kids to afford private institutions. Ever since then, costs have been going up faster, much faster than family incomes, creating more and more rationing. We stopped building additional institutions the way we did massively in the 60s and 70s, making increased scarcity and competition for spaces. And we created stratification systems. In California, we decided to only provide the University of California for the top 1/8 of our students, and to confine most students from weak high schools and poor families to community colleges with have really low successful transfer rates. That helped perpetuate the stratification and the exclusion of the rapidly growing Latino population of the state, for example, which changed from 5% of the students in the 1960s to what's now over a quarter of the students in the United States. We didn't address it. The society changed, our policy didn't change, and our policy went backwards.
So you mentioned stratification. I want to welcome Tony to start us off with this next question. We're thinking about what do we know about the impact of college access, completion, and success? What do we know from research, particularly as it relates to selective colleges, what that relationship looks like?
Well, in the end, the selective college system is selective, and it reflects sort of like snow. Wherever it falls, it takes the shape of the ground it falls on. So higher education, especially higher education, which reflects the society it rises from. And that is a very durable statistical fact. One of the things about Gary's book I like is he points this out, because I see it constantly. And that is, if you look at all deeply down, if you go 2 shovelfuls below the surface, you're going to find race. And the other piece of this in my mind is it is almost always true. Myself and others have been looking over the last few years on lots of what are essentially positive changes, I would argue, in the American education system. None of them, when you look at them separately or together, changes the essential race and class structure of American education, despite the fact that you think they would. We just did this with 38 pathways from high school to a good job by age 30. Even with all those, we picked the top 10, even with all those, none of them change appreciably the underlying racial and class structure of the United States. What Gary says, and he's right, is you always have to have affirmative action. You can't escape it. Nobody likes it, but if you're going to make change, you can't escape it. It sits in front of you, and you've got to move it. So my own bias about this is that over time, this will happen. I think there are a variety of reasons why it probably will happen. Some of them are demographic, some of them are economic. But I do think that the persistence, the stubbornness of this problem is one of the things that is most striking about it. If you're somebody who I've been involved in politics and policy a lot, and those are stubborn worlds, but they don't match this one. So I think that is the truth about who we are. My own bias is that it doesn't matter who we are. People's motivations don't matter in the end. What really matters is the way institutions work, and we firmly institutionalized our problems, and will only change them through institutions and institutional change. I don't much care or have much appetite for trying to change people's minds, but you can change the way institutions behave, and you do that with power and money.
Power and money, changing institutions. I think that's a great thing for us to ponder here at Georgetown. Sarita, I want to ask a version of that question to you two as well. Given the work that you do, where do you see the relationship between college access and success, persistence, and match, and kind of the lifelong outcomes of our minoritized youth?
Being in the company of these wonderful colleagues, I'm trying to situate my own thinking in that. And I guess I'm going to take a little bit of issue with Tony's perspective, because what matters in the work that we do is institutional leadership. So I guess that's where I'm taking issue. I think that the unit of analysis that we work on is literally individual presidents and chancellors and their willingness to lean in. And we practice equity with a Latino lens. And we have ample experience and data that suggests that when an institution develops a set of skills to use disaggregated data, to be truthful about the inquiry, which is, well, why are performance levels different? What is pliant? What can the institution do? What are you willing to do? What's the benefit of improving outcomes for Latino students? When you start to get into that, then those practices begin to make their way for all students. And in the work that we do, again, an overarching framing, not to avoid affirmative action, but to go with, you asked about morality. So what seems to be compelling people is the idea that a student who's a first-generation college goer deserves a chance. And so oftentimes that first-generation college goer is a student of color. But you don't say that necessarily. You start with the fact that they've gotten to the point of admission to your fine institution, and since they've done what was necessary to get there, is the institution willing to do its part to help them succeed? Those are the ways in which, on an individual basis, now our aggregate numbers are minuscule compared to the magnitude of Gary's scope in the book. I mean, there's over 4,000 institutions in this country, and we currently have a network of about 150 colleges and universities. But I'm an optimist. And I think that if you have that many, and they're varied of all sizes, community colleges, large state institutions, frankly, we don't have what would be considered highly selective institutions. And part of the reason we don't is highly selective institutions don't necessarily have the motivation to change.
With that in mind, Rosemary, can you tell us a little bit about what we can learn from those selective institutions that might have some motivation to change in the practices they have done, who have achieved some even modest progress in this area?
Thank you for that question, Sabrina. It's an excellent one, but I have to echo Sarita's point about the limited success that our selective institutions have experienced and have had in the area of providing access to higher education for undergraduate students. About 50, I would say there are probably about 51 or so selective institutions. Of that 51, very few of them have actually had a constant, significant increase in the representation of Black students. I'm going to focus on Black students because, to me, the race, although we talk about diversity, we cannot escape looking at Black students as a group, because that, to me, is where the biggest challenge lays, and that's the biggest challenge that continues to confront us. So to your specific question about progress that we have made, there's been very modest progress at undergraduate enrollment. Where I have frankly seen progress has been in the graduate and professional school level, where I look at my own institution here at Georgetown and looking at the significant increase over the year that's been sustainable, not only of Black students in law school, for example, but also of women. When we look at who has benefited most from affirmative action, which has been the race-conscious approach that we have taken, women have been, white women, I would say, I would argue, have really been the biggest beneficiary of affirmative action, and followed by Asian Americans and Latinos and African Americans lastly, with large. So there hasn't been really much progress. What we have seen though in the past couple of years is one of the things that COVID has done, it has resulted in a number of selective institutions making the decision to waive the submission of test scores as part of the criteria that are used to determine who gets admitted, at least at the undergraduate level. And so we've seen some modest increase in the past 2 years at those selective institutions. How sustainable that is going to be and how widespread it's going to continue for institutions to waive test scores, that remains to be seen. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And I argue, again, that at the graduate and professional level, we're seeing some modest progress in the enrollment of Black and Latino and Asian students, as well as women.
Sarita, given the network of schools that you work with, are there lessons or strategies or practices that, even starting from the leadership of those institutions down throughout their admissions processes, their ways they're supporting students, first-generation students, students of color, that you would hold out as lessons that maybe other institutions in this higher education ecosystem can learn from?
Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the overriding approaches that Excelencia uses. We believe that there are tactics and strategies that are quite replicable. One would say, they're not rocket science. They're very straightforward. And that if an institution wants to seek students of color, it's very much along the lines of even what the video invoked. Any city in America, you can easily find communities of color. It doesn't take a whole lot of anything to figure that out. And then once you do that, you decide, what is it that the institution is prepared to do? Selective, large state, community college? And what is it that you then will do to develop a rapport, a sense of trust with the wise adults of the school system, of the school? And how will you be credible if you say, if this is a student who's working hard, your best and your brightest, then you make sure that the best and the brightest of that community has half a chance when they get to the campus. And then what do you do to make sure that those students, but I'm talking very small numbers, and I'm talking about a relational approach. That's one part of this. The other, I think, is in terms of different panelists have invoked them, whether they're the multiple ways Tony has mapped his research, what helps students go from public schools into colleges and universities. What kinds of preparation do they have to be able to thrive in certain disciplines at those colleges and universities? I mean, I can go on like this. We have a searchable database called Growing What Works, and it delineates all of that. All of that, I think, is available to any college and any university that looks at its current record of service, and I'm going to use that language. If the idea is that we live in a moment where the representation of all of America is important in institutions of higher education, and as leaders of higher education, you recognize, we recognize, there are things we can do. There are tactics and strategies. In addition, there has to be political will. And I don't mean that in the elected official kind of way. I mean within the institution. Because you are doing things differently to do that. If you simply maintain, you might be able to feel comfortable with some degree of alignment with some meritocracy. But you have to confront the fact that you recognize that what you are doing is not seizing the moment, not choosing to exercise the leadership that's available to you. because we are people of means. Anybody who's in a college or a university, anybody who works in a college and university, you know that the resources that you have are not available for all. How are you going to use them and use them well? And all of that gets us bundled up in this question of race, ethnicity, gender. What are we going to do? I was saying to Nancy before we started, I've picked this sector because I think this is a principled sector. I think we believe in providing opportunities for people who want to quest, who want to thrive, and who want to work hard.
One of the themes of the book is that you can't solve this inside of the college system by itself. The college system is based on the school systems. 90% of students go to public schools in the United States. The schools are much more stratified than they were a generation ago. We've lost almost all the progress on school diversity and integration that we achieved in the 60s. We are back to the place that we were when Martin Luther King was assassinated. We've lost the progress that we made after that period. And the typical Black and Latino student is in a school that's more than 2/3 poverty. And it's in a school that teachers transfer out of systematically, teachers with experience. It's in a school with very weak peer groups. It's a school with a lot of turnover because of the instability of the housing market. It's a systematically unequal school. We have very good schools that prepare students for very good colleges. We don't have any positive policy about getting poor students of color into those schools. And the Catholic school system is a problem in that respect, especially the secondary system. So is the public school system, of course. We have really good high schools that create a superhighway into college, that you can get ready for any college in the country. And we have a lot of high schools where there is almost nothing that's taught on grade level, where you get almost none of the basic pre-college skills, independent of what your talent might be. It's the result of intense segregation and the dismantling of all of our desegregation efforts by support decisions in the Supreme Court between 1991 and 2007. We're now about to do that to higher education as well, in all likelihood. But this is an intentional action to end that effort, to end the effort that was started by Brown, and to concentrate our students of color in really unequal high schools. We found in California that a white or Asian student is 20 times more likely to be in a high-achieving high school than a Black or Latino student. And of course, Native American students, who haven't been mentioned, are the most isolated of all in lots of respects. They aren't even counted in many reports because they only account for about 1% of the students, except in a handful of states. But they are extremely disadvantaged. So we have a high school system, a preparation system that is extremely stratified by race. And it leads into a higher education system where a lot of students make their choice about whether to go to college and whether to go to a 4-year or 2-year college because of their financial situation and because of their lack of good information, lack of counseling, lack of outreach of colleges. And these big structural forces mean that colleges that want to do differently have to overcome big factors. And it also means that people in higher education can't just think of their system in isolation from the public schools. You have to think about changing the public school opportunities and you opening up the good high schools to the kids who need them the most, rather than the kids who are most privileged to start with. That's the kind of system we have right now.
So what can be done? What is the responsibility of colleges and universities to address this stratified inequity at the K-12 level, or particularly the high school level is what you focus on in the book? But what have you seen done, any of you, or what can be done?
There is I think where we're headed next, there's always a next, till there isn't. But where we're headed is We've shut down, or we're going to shut down, race-based affirmative action in selective colleges. We're going to, I think, for a time, fool with alternatives, some of which are real, to race-based affirmative action, most of which we know from the 9 states who've tried to do this one way or another, don't work very well. Arguably, in 1 or 2 places it did work. That is, the institutions were able to achieve their prior level of racial diversity. But by and large, it didn't work, and it didn't even climb back to the prior diversity levels. But there are a variety of variables you can use in admissions decisions that don't include race, but are essentially proxies for race, to be blunt about it. And you can run those. My outfit has run them over the last year or so. And you can get race without using race. Now, the problem with that will be almost immediately, if you look to the cases in Thomas Jefferson High School across the river here in Virginia, or in New York, in California, the gifted and talented high schools. There, they've done this, and in many cases, they've done it foolishly, quite in the open. But the upshot of that is what is probably coming is another wave of cases that hereafter that will target those alternatives. Whether or not, and there are people lawyers who have different opinions on this, whether or not you can bring those alternative admissions criteria down is an open question. But I think the early returns on things like the Thomas Jefferson and the other cases are really pretty clear. And the other side on this debate is very well aware of this. I've done this long enough so I know all of them. I like a bunch of them, quite frankly. They're just wrong-headed. So, I think that's what we'll do in higher ed. We'll find ways in the short haul to try to get around this, and to some extent they can be made to work. They will not achieve, they can potentially, but they're very unlikely to achieve the diversity we have now, would be my judgment. Maybe they can, and they will be miles away from the kind of diversity we want. That is, in any society, it shouldn't matter whether you're black or Latino, there ought to be some rough approximation between those high school kids that go to selective colleges and not, and so on. We're very far from that, and this is going to pull us further back from that goal, which is ultimately the long-term goal. It doesn't matter. So I think for me, Gary brings up K-12. It takes me back to K-12. I think from our current point of view, the most significant case after Brown was Rodriguez. And in the Rodriguez case, and I was one of the co-authors of Rodriguez, I'm proud to say, in the Rodriguez case, we thought we were going to win. We had the Warren Court, Nixon was president. Nixon found out that Abe Fortas, who was a Johnson justice, was taking $90 grand a year from some rich guy in New York. And he used that scandal to run him off the court. And then he got 3 more appointments. So when Rodriguez came down in '73, I still believe we're going to win. I thought Mondale was going to win. So, in the end, that's me. So in the end, I think we're back to that pathway. Now, Rodriguez crashed and burned. That is, the Supreme Court said decisively in Rodriguez that there is no right to education in America. Forget about it. But after that, the lawyers, they started suing in states based on state constitutions, based on judges' opinions, from decisions driven down from suits based on the state constitution. And since then, there is a widely accepted norm now in high school education. That is, we've had a long history now of trying to figure out what adequate education means. That's what the courts have played with at the state level for a long time now. And I think they've done well with it. All things considered, I think they've done well. And so in the end, I think the adequacy route is where this has to go. We've got to go back to basics, which is K-12. And that won't be easy. I don't think it's that difficult. The education institutions in America, the high schools and the state legislatures, have somewhat foolishly taken up the rhetoric that they get from on high, and they've all claimed that they're going to make all American high school graduates college and career ready. It's not happening. So we got them. So I think the answer is somebody, actually I've done this a long time, but in the old days it would be the Ford Foundation. Who's got enough guts to put money down for lawsuits. We should go after the states. Sue the hell out of all of them. Not hard to do. We now have the data that allows us to do, we didn't have it then. We now have data from K-12, all the way through K-12 education, up to age 40. We know who is college and career ready, and we know what the failure rate is, and we know what it looks like, and it's no surprise. So there is I think that is the highway now. Higher education is going to have to make do from here on out, and I expect higher ed leaders are no more good nor evil than anybody else. They will all try to do their best, but I think higher education is going to be hobbled here. And in some ways, I think we cheated. I think we thought, okay, we can't get this done in the mainstream institutions. We'll do this trick. And the trick is we'll have race-based affirmative action, not class-based affirmative action, by the way. We'll have race-based affirmative action. We'll skip over the tough work. It didn't work. I mean, it was bound not to work. It was never very popular. So I think in the end, it's back to K-12, and it's back to make and do in higher education. There are things coming along the way that are very good. But as Gary's work over the years has always pointed out, even the very good things don't seem to help on this problem. So, we're talking now about, seriously about college and career-ready standards, and we're talking now about BAs and two-year colleges. That will help. We're talking about dual enrollment. We're talking about a variety of changes, but all those changes, I can tell you, the data and a huge infusion of work-based learning in high schools and colleges. But I can tell you, from what we know from the data, all of those changes reinforce racial and class differences. So until you put affirmative action as a piece in the puzzle, you don't move this issue.
I would like to go back to the question that you posed, Sabrina, and that is, what is the role and responsibility of selective colleges and universities in helping with the K-12 divide? And I do believe that we do have an obligation to work with K-12. You mentioned that, Tony, in the remark that you just made. I know, for example, we have a lot of research going on at our respective institutions. We have faculty members, not only at Georgetown, but everywhere else, who are working on very important research that can inform what public policy officials are going to be doing. For example, I know Professor Maurice Jackson here at Georgetown did a study on educational attainment within the DC public schools and came up with a set of recommendations and a set of strategies that could be used to help ameliorate the situation facing our public education. Similarly, with health disparities, we have researchers who can do the work, the necessary research, to help advance this cause. So I think those are some examples of things that universities can do to help policymakers, whether we're talking about policymakers at the state and local level or at the federal level. Similarly, we have institutions that have pre-college programs, working with children from the time they're maybe third, fourth grade. You can't work with high school students and expect all of a sudden they're going to be ready for college. We have to start with the intervention very, very early on, working to inspire those young people to think critically and to think seriously that they do have a future beyond K-12. We have students who are college students who are interested in going into our communities of color to work with students in K-12 to help them again think of the college experience, bringing them to campus, providing mentoring opportunities between our college students and K-12 students. We have opportunities where we can have youth employment on our campuses. So those are some very concrete and some very tangible examples of creative solutions that we could bring to bear. And if we collectively can come together, I mean, we've got a consortium, for example, in Washington, D.C., a consortium of higher educational institutions. If you can come together collectively to address some of these issues from that standpoint, I think those are some of the real tangible ways in which we can impact K through 12 and have some direct relationships based on trust and based upon what the community needs and what we're capable of doing ourselves. And to your point, Tony, about Ford Foundation, I know we've got Mellon Foundation, and Dr. Lewis was at one time president of Mellon Foundation, so we should take advantage of some of those opportunities to kind of fund these programmatic initiatives that I think will really go a long way towards helping to bring all of the educational programs, K through 12 and colleges, together.
There's one other thing I wanted to say here, because it's part of this conversation in the policy world, and that is, in the United States, we have for a very long time avoided training. We're an education nation. We don't do training. So the Europeans are quite the opposite. They had real Nazis and real fascists to worry about after the war. We really didn't. So, in the end, they built out these systems. We're about to do that. It's long overdue in the United States. We're about to get training Pell, short-term training programs. Politicians love it. It is, if you're a Democrat, it's about building the blue wall. If you're a Republican, it's about building the other wall. It's about holding on to the white working class. So training is riding high at the moment, and you got Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg going out publicly and saying, people, the best thing about our infrastructure bills is that it gives jobs to high school graduates. Which high school graduates do you think we're talking about here? So, and I'm all for it. You don't let your own idealism get in the way of somebody else's job. But the shift to training is going to make this problem more difficult, because we know that training will further segregate the post-secondary education and training system, because it's about to become a post-secondary education and training system. So I think, and in the meantime, for people like Jack, the reason this works for somebody out on the stump, if you hold a press conference for one of your infrastructure projects and there's any press in the room, why have the meeting if there's no press in the room? But if you have any press in the room, one of them's going to ask you, does this mean you don't have to go to college? Buttigieg, Biden, and any Republican you can find will say absolutely. So the BA, oddly enough, is under attack at the moment, in spite of the fact that it's doing quite well in terms of its economic performance. So the situation's going to get more complicated. I mean, we're going to have to find pathways from training to degrees and on and on and on, from high schools to community colleges to four-year schools and so on. All that widely recognized, I think, by governors and policymakers. They do get this. Because they end up holding the bag if it doesn't work. So I think in the end, it's going to get more complicated for a time. But I think generally, the makings of a solution are there.
Gary, you mentioned in your book, you emphasize this idea about the pathways, right?
Yes.
What do you think is higher ed's responsibility to impact the pathway to themselves?
Well, I think higher education has a lot of possible responsibilities. One is to document what's happening. Most people don't realize it. Most people think everybody gets a fair chance to get ready for college, which is completely wrong and inaccurate. That's an important and easy function for higher education to do, and not doing it very well in most places. There's a lot of possibilities that can be documented. Here in D.C., which I've lived in several times in my career, it's changing. It's becoming a predominantly non-black city. That's already happened. There's a lot of diversity in the community, but not in the schools. And there's no positive effort to draw the groups together in the schools. We're seeing every major city in California is going through massive gentrification right now. and massive suburbanization of people of color, most of whom are going to school in suburbs now, but in declining suburbs. There's no regional plans, there's no regional schools being created, magnet schools that would prepare people for college. Colleges can create high schools that are really good. UCLA has made one called the Community School in Los Angeles, in an area that wasn't producing anybody who'd go to the University of California, which now is. It's not real complicated to do that. You know what a good high school has to have. It has to have dedicated teachers. It has to have a demanding curriculum. It has to have serious support. It has to have faculty that stay there long enough to institute a big change and so forth. Colleges can actually do that. They can create more schools that would prepare students for their college, for example. That's something they can do. There are these dual enrollment programs. Unfortunately, they're being disproportionately used by more privileged students rather than disadvantaged students. We have to focus on who gets into them and how we keep them in there, because those can be transformative for students who are completely isolated from pre-collegiate opportunities, even pre-collegiate imagination. We can use financial aid in different ways. We need to think about financial aid for the kinds of families that we're actually recruiting. If the family is not a family that can contribute and a family that needs to be supported by the student who has to work during college because his parents are sick or can't work for one reason or another, the financial aid people need to deal with that, not to pretend that it's a family that doesn't have those special circumstances. We need transition programs. We need summer programs. We need during high school and at the beginning of college, so students can get the pre-collegiate skills that students in a good high school would have gotten. You can get students who've never written a paper, who are very smart, but totally unprepared for what you have in a freshman class in any kind of selective college. We can deal with many of the transition problems. There's a whole series of places where students drop off the path to college. They have to either be addressed by getting students into good pathways that already exist, which we tend not to work on, or we have to create those conditions individually in school, the kind of schools that we actually have. We need to look seriously at the financing and especially at the staffing of our public schools. Right now, most of our cities, we have contracts for teachers that enable them, the experienced teachers, all to transfer out of the students where the low-income students of color are concentrated. And they do transfer out. Because we're not rewarding them for working in those extremely demanding schools. We're punishing them by saying they're failures because their grades aren't the same as they get in another school. There's many, many dimensions of this that we can make a difference on. We need to focus on the outcomes, and we need to hold people responsible for changing the outcomes. In other words, what you did in the civil rights era is we went from programs that focused on discrimination, looking at documenting individual discrimination, to programs that focused on systemic change, like the Voting Rights Act, which said, if people aren't voting here, damn it, you lose local control. Period. The federal government will take over your electoral system if it's necessary. And that produced real change. In public schools, we actually signed students so they were integrated. We actually transferred faculty. All of those things happened under court orders, and they worked. There was huge gains that took place during that period. Rucker Johnson's wonderful book on the effect of integration on students in the South shows profound transformative effects of that process. A lot of these things we've done and we've abandoned, or we've done in a couple of demonstrations and then we said that's enough. Or we have foundations that say, we'll fund that for 2 or 3 years. And somehow you're supposed to keep it going when there are no funds. You know, we have to think systematically about this and focus on the outcomes, make people responsible, and measure the progress seriously. Because these things can be figured out, but they won't be figured out unless it becomes a basic imperative of the institution. And people will be held responsible and will be watched, and will have to invent solutions. we've gotten ourselves into a mess. We're going to have to invent our way out of it. It's one thing colleges should be really good at helping out with.
We definitely have heard from our panelists that colleges and institutions have power and a responsibility to deconstruct each of the walls that you have erected or documented that are erected in your book, Gary. I think now it's time for us to move toward questions from the audience. Thank you, Kristen, for cueing me on that. So we should have a microphone or 2 microphones available for those questions.
Just wanted to ask your guys' thoughts on proprietary schools or for-profit post-secondary education. We are talking about low-income students and equality of opportunity, but the enrollment figures at that sector are very different from selective institutions, and I wanted to get the panelists' thoughts on for-profit schools.
Inherent about the business model that makes them usury. There's just the track record. The fact that so many of the for-profit institutions have really poor performance when it relates to the students enrolling, getting value for the money that they borrow. My colleague, Deborah Santiago, years ago, raised up how effective they are at targeting low-income students of color. And what they do and how they do it is quite replicable. Selective institutions could very easily write to low-income students of color, could very easily say to these students, we want you, we'll help you get admitted, we'll help you support your educational experience, and we'll help you get a job when you graduate. Selective institutions aren't focused that way. They don't feel obligated to do that, and they don't do that. Proprietary institutions do.
I would answer the question differently. I'd say the proprietary institutions do have a bad business model for equity purposes because they're built around just getting the Pell Grant and the maximum student loan, signing up the students, and they put a huge investment in recruitment, extremely powerful recruitment, and almost none in support systems in many cases. That's why we get these dismal results that led the Congress to crack down on them, and the Obama administration to disestablish many of them, and the Biden administration to refund the student loans that or to forgive it because they were in such institutions that had terrible records of completion, and terrible records of placement because their credentials weren't respected. So it's right to look critically at those institutions as a group and to think about insisting that they produce results or not be eligible for funding. The problem was that the Pell Grant was set up and the student loan programs were set up in a process that had no control at all of quality and no control of outcomes. It was just an open invitation to private interests to create high turnover, guaranteed funding because they had the guaranteed loans as well as the Pell Grants, and to deliver minimum services and to just completely shuffle. One of the sad things about the proprietary institutions is that a lot of people who get Veterans Administration benefits for service in the military are recruited by these institutions, don't get a credential that's of any value in the labor market. So we have to really watch these institutions carefully because the way they've been set up in many cases is all about recruitment and almost not very much about education.
I think the regulatory change that's coming, that will arrive within the next few years, that will really matter here, is that in the end, the Congress has decided they want to do 2 things with post-secondary education and training. And there's bipartisan agreement here, although not enough courage to do a mandate to have it done. But they want to do 2 things. One is want absolute transparency on all college degrees. That is, to the extent that they provide employment earnings. so that the bias is we're not going to stop you from majoring in archaeology, but we're going to tell you what happened to all the people who did that at the school you're going to. And if you decide then to take out loans to do that, that's your problem. That's not courage on the part of a politician. That's cowardice. They don't want to be accused of trying to interfere in classroom learning in higher education. So, but the other side of that agreement is that we got to do more than that on training, including for-profit training. And there we have to regulate. And there, the current agreement is, if a training program doesn't deliver 15% value added, you can't have any public money for it. This passed the House. And at the same time, any training program has to pay at least, in the end, has to put you in occupation that pays at least $25,000 a year. So we're going to have a bit of a bifurcated system here, a couple of markets, one being training, one being degrees. That doesn't solve the problem in the end that Gary's talking about, I think. Briefly, I've been involved in a series of cases against for-profits as an expert witness. My favorite is when we found out, and they tried to defend themselves, we found out that a for-profit working in Illinois had a criminal justice program that promised to make people in prison police officers in Chicago. And they apparently were unaware that if you are a felon, you can't become a police officer in Chicago. So they went too far. I mean, is really what happened with those poor people. They weren't all bad.
I would also elevate something that I heard from all of you. Sarita, you talked about, and you did too, Gary, the recruitment efforts of these institutions, but then implied that maybe there are other institutions that have the support systems that could help the students that for-profit institutions can recruit so well, but help them thrive. And I wonder what these broader, maybe more selective institutions or more equity-oriented institutions can learn from recruitment, since they actually have the structures in place to support these diverse students as well. I think I heard you elevating that as for us as well.
I mean, what's fascinating about the way this conversation sounds is if we're disagreeing. I think we all agree that the traditions, the record, the impact of for-profit institutions has not been good for students. The dynamic, though, the point that I think is important for those institutions that have means is, so why is it that for-profit institutions are so effective at reaching this population? Because other institutions could do that. They don't. And that, I think, is an important recognition. It's not that Latinos and Black students somos tontos, we don't understand. It's not that. It's that we're optimistic, that we believe that if someone is from an institution is telling you it's so, you want to believe, and you do. I think that the potential of seeing a track record of, okay, you can go here, but here's what happened to these other students who went there. I mean, I think that those things are all going to be in the mix. But I would hope in this setting, in the echo of this book, that we don't duck the fact that selective institutions and the budgets of those institutions suggest that they have the resources to be overt, to be aggressive, to go out there, and to be agents for justice, social justice, and to do this work. And in all the wonderful things that Gary suggested are methods that we know and can replicate. I think for all of us that are here in this room and are thinking about this topic, the things that each of us can do, and that we definitely can do collectively, is to know the institutions that take this on, to know the institutions that buck the trend, to know the selective institutions that actually are doing the kinds of things that Rosemary is talking about. Because that kind of influence is something we all have and can use. We, I think, can continually elevate the expectation that institutions of higher education have the capacity to do this. Now, whether or not individual institutions can do it at the largest scale that we want, obviously not. We're going to have to bind together. and become a force to do that. And that doesn't sidestep all that's coming when the decision goes before the Supreme Court. I'm an activist by heart, so I can't sit it out. It's always about what we can do, and we have to do. If we don't, then we're taking a side on the negative.
Let's hear from our next question from the audience.
Thank you so much to the panelists for the talk, and thank you, Professor Orfield, for your book. And so, as I see it, there are two aspects to the talk. One is about selectivity, and then one is about success, or access and success. The discussion around success has been focused on selective institutions and affirmative action, but it seems that we talked about building up of walls and having students who benefit from affirmative action or who seem to benefit from affirmative action, they are being included within the walls, right? The walls aren't being knocked down in a sense, right? And the question is, how do we knock down the walls? And so having this focus on selective universities sort of reinforces this idea that selective universities are the primary driver of leading to a sort of middle class or middle class life, right? And as Professor Orfield pointed out, the overwhelming majority of students attend public universities in this country. Also, with the Reagan era, you've seen this kind of massive disinvestment in public universities. And so, I'm interested in large-scale sort of structural investments and change. And one of the things is that there's been a sort of move away from investing in public universities at a high level. Only recently, piecemeal in states, perhaps New Mexico, a little bit in New Jersey, you've seen sort of a reinvestment in providing free public education. Part of also what I think needs to be discussed is rethinking public education as a public good, as an extension of public universities. I think providing an alternative model to the selective university system in the US, and thinking about university as a form of meritocracy, particularly in light of the Supreme Court being extremely hostile to racial jurisprudence, right? Only for a brief blip of time, under the Warren Court, did the Supreme Court actually do anything that was, considered to be beneficial, right, along racial lines? And it seems that this focus on affirmative action, which will die, right, the court has shown itself to be rather harsh and not incrementalist, and being willing to push a conservative ideology. And so we will see the end of affirmative action as being a solution to creating, genuine meritocracy. And so my question is, what does it look like when affirmative action is done and we need genuine solutions of political economy? Because we've seen court-based solutions, for example, Brown v. Board, did not reintegrate U.S. society, right? That didn't lead a court-based solution. And as the legal scholar Jamal Green points out in his book, How Rights Went Wrong, this overly focus on a rights-based solution in the courts is not reflective of how people understood their rights to be dispersed around various institutions, not just the courts, but in other civil society organizations. And so the question I ask is, what about this reinvestment in public universities, and public universities as a public good, too? And what is the role of HBCUs, right? Yes, integration is a wonderful goal, but what about the role of investing in universities that overwhelmingly Black students attend, or that Black students attend public universities or HBCUs, and investing in those institutions to provide an alternative to the selective university model, so that selective universities aren't seen as the sine qua non of being the vehicle for entering a middle class in the U.S. Thank you.
That's a question for a PhD dissertation. I'd like to say a few things about your different questions. One is, there should never be a choice between investing in the HBCUs and the Hispanic serving institutions and the elite institutions. They both need to be done. The interesting thing we found out in a study of admissions practices in universities and colleges across the country is that those people who practice affirmative action by race also practice it by income. The people who don't practice affirmative action by race also don't practice it by income. It seems to be there are institutions who do both, and there's institutions who do neither. And everybody's trying to say you have to choose one or the other. You don't have to choose one or the other. They both need to be done. In terms of reinvestment in public education, One of the basic federal investment in public education is the Pell Grant and student loans. We've shifted from basically focusing on grant funding to loan funding. That's been very negative in terms of equity, since a lot of families of color don't want to take on huge loan debts, and they have much greater difficulty paying them back because of the labor market and other things. We should be, certainly, as a basic structural change in higher education, not only increasing state funding, but greatly increasing the Pell Grant. President Biden promised to double it. That would still be, it used to fund 3/4 of the cost of public four-year colleges. Now it funds 30%. So we need to greatly increase that to get back to the level of equity we have in college access in the 1970s. Most of our states don't have any significant need-based support for students. And a lot of them have merit-based support that goes to students with the highest test scores and the highest qualifications. That just gives money mostly to students who are already highly qualified and could go anyway. So we need to think about those kinds of structures, opening the door of financial possibilities. That is a big change. We really were on the course of doing that in the 1970s, and we abandoned it. The 1980 in the Reagan administration was a major turning point towards what I call colorblind policy. But it's also class blind in terms of equity provisions. We need to reactivate the sensitivity that we had during the social movement era of the 60s, when we realized we couldn't change these things without thinking about race and class. And we did actually change them quite dramatically. It's not true that all these policies failed. The Brown and the decisions that were related to it ended most of Jim Crow in the South. We had a completely apartheid society in the South before the Civil Rights Revolution. Now it's much like the rest of the country. And the schools in the South, which were 100% segregated before Brown, are the most integrated region, even after all these years of retrogression. So these changes, many of these changes had enduring effects. And it is possible to make changes. But we stopped trying. And we're forbidding some of them.
I would really like to end and wrap up on that note, that it is possible to make these changes. Even given what we are facing and what we have faced, we have evidence that we have made progress, even modest, and we know what to do, and we know what's needed to make that progress. So I thank all of our panelists for joining us and for the questions. And before we're going to wrap up, I'd like to bring to the podium Nancy Cantor, who is the Chancellor of Russell University's Newark and the co-editor of the Our Compelling Interest book series. Nancy will give us closing remarks. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. Oops. Okay. Well, first, let's really thank our panelists. So I will just take some minutes to try to put this in perspective of our whole book series. We've really dedicated our book series to the premise of the positive intertwining, as Earl said, of diversity and democracy in a prosperous society. Yet as Gary's book so forcefully outlines, and as our panelists, even though we want to be positive, as Sabrina said, but as our panelists have underscored today, we've had for 40 or so years a society where prosperity is increasingly carved off for only a few, where policies that purport to be colorblind in reality promote a racial dividing line between the haves and have-nots, between those who have access successfully to the full educational pathways from pre-K to college to prosperous careers, and those who are doomed from the beginning by Gary's walls around opportunity. He spoke about some of them, let me reiterate. Segregated schools, inadequate preparatory curriculum and college counseling, and often discriminatory disciplinary practices, and inadequate and not sufficiently race-sensitive financial aid policies that fail to account for the realities of family circumstances. So education has become a sorting machine, as Tony and his colleagues in another book in their volume on the merit myths say, and we need to dismantle that with both race-conscious and race-sensitive policies and practices. We can't realize the benefits of diversity if, as Stella Flores in her commentary on Gary's book says, we maintain systems of opportunity hoarding, exclusion, and artificially colorblind measures of merit. We can't solve a racial problem in non-racial ways. That's the premise. It doesn't mean we're going to be able to do that. We've got to be creative. But let's remember, as we go into this, that the so-called colorblind, which also means income blind, status quo, will increasingly put our society in peril, as was described in the very first volume of our series. As Bill Fry outlined, our diversity explosion is marching forward, and yet, as Gary tells us in this volume, we sit with policies and practices in the education space, and many other spaces, as we know, that fail to leverage the talent of this next diverse generation. And therefore, as Tony and Nicole Smith noted in their essay in that first volume entitled The Economic Value of Diversity, and I quote, educational inequality threatens competitiveness in our post-industrial future. As Stella says in her commentary in Gary's book, and I quote, the move forward is not to deny color, language, and culture, but instead for colleges and universities, and I would add pre-K to 12 schools, to take into account those factors as assets for a multiracial and globally competitive nation. I urge that as we think positively about the change we can make, we transfer from a deficit framework to an asset framework. We think positively about what a multiracial, multicultural America looks like and work from that advantage to convince people to take race sensitivity into terms. We know in the earlier books in this series, Scott Page on the diversity bonus in a knowledge economy, Eboo Patel on religious diversity in the American promise, we know that we can't get there unless we underscore, teach it in K-12, teach it in universities, that the racial dividing line is perpetuated by colorblind policies, by ignoring our past and our current implicit, often, practices. Whether the Supreme Court lets us be race conscious or not, what we cannot do is accept a colorblind set of approaches. We cannot give in to that. There are a lot of people who say that colorblind will only affect affirmative action admissions in a few select institutions. I want to posit here that it will have a ripple effect that is much broader and much more influential than just admissions. The minute the Supreme Court comes forward in both the voting rights cases and the affirmative action case and crushes colorblind attitudes and policies, or perpetuates colorblind attitudes and policies and practices, that will stream down to K-12. So the kinds of desegregation work that Gary is talking about, and we see this in my state of New Jersey, the progressive state of New Jersey that was the last northern state to get rid of slavery, has some of the most segregated by race and class schools. We are suing them as part of the Latino Action Network at all versus the state of New Jersey? Precisely because it begins there. We cannot think that a Supreme Court decision perpetuating colorblind policies will only affect particular admissions policies in a few selective institutions. It will be taken up as a mantra, and it will ripple out and affect a lot of what happens. Let's remember, let's go back to 1968, when the Kerner Commission said, everyone does better when everyone does better. Everyone will not think that everyone does better when everyone does better if the zero-sum mentality that is behind colorblind perspectives ripples out and has its effect. As my colleague, civil rights lawyer Elise Boddy, echoing Gary and having worked with Gary, says, and I quote, "Segregation by race and class is a load-bearing wall for inequality. It produces deep unfairness in our educational system. Segregation also erodes our democracy by breeding distrust of people who are different, lessons that people often carry into adulthood." And that's what we should be so afraid of. And yet we need to be positive about what we can do in the face of that. We cannot just sit back and let a new era of championing colorblindness by the courts come at a moment when Black and Latina and Indigenous talent is consistently pushed off the pathways to educational success. That will only doom us even further to the perfect storm of exclusion unless we push back with the forthrightness of the kinds of policies and practices suggested in Gary's last chapter and in Stella Flores' commentary and Jim Anderson's commentaries and by today's panelists. As we've seen before in this country's history, education is the front line of the fight for freedom. And we need to be vocal and bold, I would argue race conscious no matter what they say, and race sensitive for sure, as Gary suggests in this book, and as we promote throughout our book series. So I thank you for being here, for thinking about this dilemma, but I hope we all leave and create the kinds of networks that were talked about here today. Networks to think about how we can indeed face up to the past and its influence on the present, and go forth with a little bit of optimism that collectively we can get some of this done, even despite what the courts may say. So with that, I welcome you all to the reception, and most importantly, Gary, you can't go out there yet because everybody's going to take their book and get it signed on stage with Gary Orfield. So thank you all.